Hello everybody, and happy Labor Day. Welcome to week number 3 of COMM 1270. By now you should be getting the hang of everything in terms of completing weekly activities as well as doing the weekly quizzes with the chapters. I think that last week you all did a really good job overall on your activities. You did a really great job of taking concepts from the editorial and applying them well to things that were talked about in the book. So great job there. Keep thinking about the specific types of claims and spheres and where those things operate as you go through those. So last week in chapter 1, we talked about kind of what is an argument, what is a decision maker, how do arguments get reached, what is support used for an argument. And in chapter 2, there's much more of a focus on assessing critically the arguments that are being made. So how do we decide if an argument is reasonable or not? Like, how do we figure out commonplaces or where arguments start? That's a main focus of this chapter. So trying to figure out how decision makers assess arguments and therefore what somebody needs to do when they make an argument is a major focus. So one of the things that the textbook lays out is what makes an argument reasonable. The easiest way to think about a reasonable argument or assessing reasonableness is, does the argument fit the criteria that the decision makers establish? So for instance, if I had a friend who was lactose intolerant and they were trying to decide a type of ice cream to get, then me saying, oh, hey, you should get this, Tillamook chocolate ice cream wouldn't be a good argument to make because it doesn't fit the criteria of the decision maker. My friend is lactose intolerant. They can't eat chocolate ice cream that has dairy in it. So my argument doesn't fit the criteria of the decision makers, so therefore it's not reasonable. So to put it another way, think about it from the perspective of a decision maker in terms of what they can do, in terms of how they're making their decision, in terms of the values that they might have, and try to determine, does your argument match those things? You're trying to convince somebody, and so trying to figure out their views and how they might reach a decision is helpful when you're assessing arguments. So, one of the things that's talked about in the textbook too is that a lot of times arguments aren't reasonable. And regardless of where you fall politically, I'm sure that's something that you've seen over the last several months, or perhaps the last several years, right? So, unreasonable arguments are oftentimes advanced because we don't think critically about the arguments that we hear. So, for instance, take something like international aid. A lot of people might think, we donate a ton of money to international aid. We should be spending more money elsewhere. When in reality, we actually spend less than 1% of the US budget on international aid. That's an example of arguments that might be somewhat unreasonable, but are nevertheless not critically assessed. We kind of take it as a fact that we might spend a lot on international aid without thinking about the argument and the actual evidence or lack of evidence that's used for that argument too. So the textbook talks a lot about how we advance arguments that are not necessarily reasonable. It also talks about ways that you can develop good starting points for developing reasonable arguments, right? So starting points, including interpretation of language, right, or understanding where people are coming from is really important. So when my friend tells me that they can't eat chocolate ice cream because they're lactose intolerant, they're using language, and I'm interpreting language to figure out where my friend is at on that, and figuring out what they can and they can't do. So that's an example of using those starting points. Another starting point is the fact that maybe the Tillamook chocolate ice cream I'm recommending has lactose in it, whereas something like sherbet doesn't. So that's another starting point that might be used in making that decision. Additionally, you can think about something like a presumption. So a presumption is kind of like innocent until proven guilty. A presumption suggests that you can believe something unless there's a good amount of evidence to show that something is not the case. So I might reasonably presume that Tillamook chocolate ice cream had lactose in it until maybe I read the ingredients and I found that it didn't, right? So presumptions really require an argument that shows why something isn't the case for people to believe it. So for instance, we can presume the status quo, things as they are, right, are okay until somebody presents an argument that says we need to make a change or do some sort of action, right? So it falls upon individuals making and advancing arguments to demonstrate that there needs to be some sort of action taking place, or else we will presume that we don't need to take an action. That's where policy claims are ultimately really important. Another starting point is probabilities. When you're trying to make decisions, you don't necessarily know what the actual outcome is. So maybe you decide that you want to go, sneak out and watch a movie with your friends instead of doing homework. Well, you don't know necessarily what the consequence of not doing homework is, and you don't necessarily know what you might lose out on if you go hang out with friends. So you're trying to kind of assess and speculate what might happen based on the decision that you make. And you might draw from things like your past experience of spending time with friends or your past experience of doing homework in order to reach a decision there. So, right, past is prologue, and we use our experiences from the past to make decisions in the present that then affect the future. So probabilities are an important starting point for argumentation too. You can also think about commonplaces, and the textbook talks about commonplaces as kind of shared assumptions or beliefs. A really good example of that is the use of various idioms or famous quotations, or kind of examples like that, right? So we oftentimes hear the quotation, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And that might be a commonplace that you elicit when you talk to a friend. So maybe your friend didn't get a great score on an exam, like the LSAT, maybe they're getting ready for law school, and you say, hey, try again, right? You're using a commonplace, a common expression or phrase as a starting point to make an argument that they should try again. So ultimately, those are some of the things that are talked about in Chapter 2. Remember, Chapter 2 is really a focus on the fundamentals established in Chapter 1. We know who decision makers are, we know how decisions are made, we know that there are various spheres as well as claims that get advanced, and we know that there's support for arguments too. Therefore, you can think about Chapter 2 as helping in assessing how decision makers decide on particular arguments. That's helpful if you're a decision maker and you're trying to decide what to do day to day, but it's also helpful if you're an arguer because you can think about and empathize with the perspectives and the decisions that people are trying to make. So if I tell you to take COMM 1270, then you as a student and the issues and interests that you might have are really important in terms of me making that decision and me making that argument. So thinking about what criteria and basis for decisions is being made is really helpful when you're assessing the reasonableness or quality of arguments.